June 24th, 1944, near St. Lo, Normandy. German tank crews laughed when they saw the first Shermans. By nightfall, those same men were watching their Panthers sink into the mud while the toys kept moving. That's when they realized this war wasn't about who had the best machine. It was about who refused to stop. The rain had begun before dawn. Cold, thin, and endless, the kind that seeped into every seam, every joint, every lung. The hedgerows around St. Lo were alive with the hum of insects and distant thunder, and beneath that natural rhythm came something heavier, more mechanical. The slow churn of treads against wet earth. In the shallow trench beside a mud-soaked field, Oberfeldwebel Karl Richter peered through his field binoculars, the lenses flecked with rain. Beyond the mist lay a column of American armour creeping through the narrow lanes of Normandy. Green-painted shapes, rounded turrets, stubby guns, the M4 Shermans. His loader, Franz Meyer, spat into the mud. There they are, the famous American death traps. The crew chuckled from inside their Panther tank, the laughter echoing off the steel walls. The Panther was a masterpiece, 45 tons of precision engineering, its 75mm KWK 42 cannon capable of punching through Allied armour at nearly 2 kilometres. They were proud of it. They had reason to be. "Look at them," said Karl, lowering the binoculars. "Thin armour. Weak gun. They'll melt the first time we open fire." Inside the turret, the radio hissed with static. Reports came in. Allied armour advancing through Carentan, Isigny, St. Lo, thousands of them. But the German tankers didn't worry. Their commanders had told them the same thing again and again, quality over quantity. And the Panther was quality. They had heard the jokes from veterans of the Eastern Front, how Shermans caught fire so easily that soldiers called them Ronsons, after the American cigarette lighters. Lights every time. Karl repeated the phrase with a smirk as he lit his own cigarette. Let them come. The morning fog began to lift. Across the hedgerows, the first distant booms of artillery rolled like thunder. The ground trembled beneath their boots. Birds scattered from the treetops. The smell of diesel and wet soil filled the air. "Engine on," Karl ordered. The Panther's Maybach engine growled to life, coughing smoke. The interior vibrated underfoot, every bolt rattling. The gunner, Otto Brandt, adjusted the optics, scanning the fields ahead. They waited. Through the narrow viewing slit, Karl saw the first Sherman emerge, cautious, slow, turret swivelling left to right, then another, then 5 more. Their engines growled like tractors, not predators. "Range, 800 metres, Otto said. "Target, lead tank." Karl's gloved hand came down hard. "Fire!" The cannon erupted. The entire tank shook with the recoil. Through the scope, Otto saw the shell streak across the open field, and a heartbeat later, the lead Sherman exploded in a column of flame. A cheer went up inside the Panther. "One shot!" Franz yelled. "Straight through the front." They reloaded, fired again. Another Sherman stopped moving, smoke pouring from its hatch. 2 kills in under a minute. The laughter returned. The crew pounded each other's backs as the next American tank fired, its shell ricocheting harmlessly off their frontal armour. Sparks danced, but the Panther stood firm. Karl grinned. "That's all you've got?" he shouted into the rain, as if the enemy could hear him. "You can't even scratch us." Another German tank to their right joined in, its gun booming. A third opened fire from behind a hedgerow. Within minutes, the field ahead was an inferno. 6 Shermans ablaze, hatches open, smoke curling skyward. It was everything they'd been promised. Superior firepower, superior armour, superior men. And yet, when Karl tried to move the tank forward, something wasn't right. The engine revved, but the Panther didn't budge. The tracks spun, throwing up gouts of mud. He increased throttle. The wheels only sank deeper. "Driver!" Karl snapped. Franz grimaced. "We're bogged down." Karl slammed his fist against the hatch. "Impossible! This is solid ground." But it wasn't. Not anymore. The rain had softened the field into a pit of quicksand. Around them, the other Panthers were struggling too, heavy machines sinking into the mire, their immense weight turning power into paralysis. Ahead, the surviving Shermans didn't retreat. They spread out, fanning through the hedgerows, manoeuvring like a pack of wolves. Karl watched, disbelieving, as one Sherman flanked the burning wrecks, its treads clawing easily through the mud that had swallowed the German tanks whole. "They shouldn't be able to do that," muttered Otto. But they did. The Panther's engine screamed as it tried to break free. Smoke filled the turret. The mud clung to its treads like glue. Karl looked again through his scope, and for the first time he saw an American tank aiming back. The gun flashed. The impact rocked the Panther's hull. The shell didn't penetrate, but the shock rattled their bones. Another shot followed. Then another. One hit the turret ring. Another slammed into the rear armor, denting it deep. Franz shouted, "They're circling us!" Karl's fingers tightened on the controls, fury and disbelief boiling together. The Panther, the pride of German engineering, was now an iron coffin. He didn't laugh anymore. "Cease fire," he said quietly. "They're not fighting us. They're outlasting us." The words hung in the smoke-filled turret as outside, the Shermans moved like unstoppable ghosts through the mud. June 25th, 1944. The outskirts of St. Lo, Normandy. The night sky was orange. Fires from the afternoon battle still burned on the horizon, reflecting off low-hanging clouds. Rain continued to fall in fine, misty sheets, hissing when it struck the wrecks that littered the fields. Karl Richter sat on the turret of his immobilized Panther, helmet off, hair soaked through, listening to the sound of distant engines, American engines, the deep, rhythmic growl of Sherman tanks moving somewhere in the darkness. "Still stuck," muttered Franz, half buried up to his knees in mud as he dug around the treads with a shovel. "This ground's cursed." Karl didn't answer. His cigarette had gone out hours ago. Every spark of confidence that had filled the crew that morning had been smothered by rain and humiliation. Around them, 4 other Panthers were stranded too. Massive machines, each worth more than 50 Shermans in cost and effort, now sitting powerless in the dark. Their commander's voice crackled over the radio. "Panther Platoon 27, fall back east. Repeat, fall back. Allied infantry approaching from the south." Franz looked up from his mud trench, eyes wide. "Fall back? How? We can't move." Karl leaned into the hatch. "Try the starter again." The driver twisted the key. The Maybach engine coughed, whined, then died with a long metallic sigh. A puff of black smoke rose from the rear vent. "Again!" Karl barked. Nothing. "Fuel pumps clogged," said Otto, wiping grime from his face. "Mud's in the intake." Karl stared into the distance. The Sherman's engines were growing louder now. They were moving closer, methodically, like an approaching tide. The crew worked faster, digging, cursing, slipping. Franz's shovel struck something solid, a rock maybe, and the handle snapped. He tossed the broken wood aside. "We're done," he said. Karl climbed back inside. "Radio HQ. Tell them—" Static. The signal was gone. Then, faintly through the mist, came the clatter of machine gun fire. Short, controlled bursts. The sound was different from the German MG-42, slower, more deliberate. American. "Get ready," Karl said. "Load armor-piercing." Otto rammed a shell into the breach. The metallic click echoed in the cramped turret. Sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold. Through the periscope, Karl spotted movement, a Sherman emerging from the tree line about 400 meters away. Its hull was covered in mud, its gun steady, its crew exposed on top, scanning the field with binoculars. Another followed, then 3 more. Karl exhaled slowly. Hold fire. Wait for them to close. He knew his Panther's gun could kill them long before they got near, but what was the point if he couldn't move? If he revealed his position now, the Shermans would simply flank him. The American tanks moved in a line, engines humming, treads cutting through the muck like it was water. They maneuvered with ease, lighter, faster, made for this kind of terrain. Franz whispered, "They're mocking us now." And maybe they were. One Sherman stopped directly in front of a sunken Panther 50 meters away, turret turning, gun adjusting, and fired. The German tank's hull erupted in fire, flames bursting from its hatch. A second later, its ammunition cooked off, sending shards of steel whistling into the night. Otto ducked instinctively. "They're burning our whole line." Karl's voice was calm, but cold. "They can see our exhaust heat through the rain. They're hunting us one by one." He adjusted his scope again. Another Sherman was coming up the left flank. Karl fired. The cannon thundered. The recoil slammed his shoulder. The shell streaked through the night, direct hit. The Sherman's turret flew upward in a plume of flame. The crew cheered instinctively, but it was hollow. 2 more Shermans emerged right behind the destroyed one. "They just keep coming," whispered Franz. "For everyone we kill." 3 more replace it, Otto finished. The Panther lurched as another artillery barrage began, American howitzers pounding the area to flush them out. Explosions shook the ground. Mud rained from the ceiling. The tank's interior filled with dust and smoke. Franz shouted over the noise, "They're coordinating it!" The tanks and the artillery, together. Karl gritted his teeth. They fight with machines, not pride. Outside, the Shermans pressed forward, their silhouettes flickering through the flames. The mud that had trapped the German tanks now seemed to be carrying the Americans onward, like the very earth had changed allegiance. Karl's world was shrinking, 1 shell, 1 breath, 1 second at a time. He realized something then, something no German commander had ever dared to say aloud. The Panther wasn't a weapon of war anymore. It was a monument to arrogance. And as another explosion ripped through the field, Karl understood the cruelest truth of all. The mud had chosen its side. June 27th, 1944. Near Le Désert, west of Saint-Lô. The air stank of cordite and burnt oil. A thick grey fog hung low over the fields, crawling between hedgerows like smoke searching for survivors. Crows circled above the wrecks, their cries lost beneath the distant thunder of artillery. The battle for Normandy was no longer a single clash. It was a slow, grinding suffocation. Karl Richter's crew had been stranded for nearly 48 hours. Their Panther sat half submerged in mud, angled awkwardly against the slope of a hill. The once glorious machine was now little more than a steel tomb. Franz leaned against the hull, drenched, hollow-eyed. "If we stay here, they'll find us. If we run, we'll be shot." Karl didn't respond. He was watching the horizon, the faint glow of Allied fires creeping closer with every hour. The sound of engines never stopped now. Even in the dead of night, Shermans prowled through the mist like predators that didn't need rest. Inside the tank, the temperature was unbearable. The smell of diesel and sweat mixed with the faint odour of cordite from their last shot. Otto sat beside the main gun, whispering to himself, clutching the pendant of his iron cross. "Maybe they'll pass us," he muttered. "They can't find every Panther." But they could, and they would. The radio hissed with broken transmissions, scattered reports of retreats, ambushes, entire companies overrun. "Panther Division 116 is falling back toward Coutances," one voice shouted through static. "The Americans, they're everywhere." Everywhere! Karl wiped the condensation from the scope and peered through it again. Through the fog he saw movement, Small figures, hunched, darting between hedgerows. Infantry, American infantry. He ducked back inside. They're advancing on foot. At least a platoon. Franz reached for his MP-40. Orders? Hold position, Karl said. No lights, no movement. Minutes passed. Then came the sound. Boots slapping through mud, the metallic jingle of gear, faint English voices carried by the wind. Check that field. Watch the ridge. Karl's hand tightened around his pistol. The crew barely breathed. A flare arced through the fog, bathing the field in ghostly white light. For one heartbeat, everything was visible. The burned-out Shermans, the shattered trees, and their own panther, looming like a half-buried beast. "Over there!" someone shouted in English. Automatic gunfire erupted. Bullets clanged off the panther's hull. The crew ducked instinctively, though the rounds couldn't pierce the armour. Otto swung the turret toward the muzzle flashes. "Permission to fire!" Karl hesitated. Every instinct told him to fight back, but firing would reveal their exact position to the Shermans that surely weren't far behind. The decision was made for him. A tank engine roared nearby, deeper, smoother than theirs. The ground trembled as the sound drew closer. "Sherman," Franz whispered. They brought armour support. The Panther's gun swiveled toward the noise. Karl squinted through the scope. There it was, a silhouette moving steadily through the fog, its headlight faint but confident. Karl's jaw clenched. "Fire!" Otto pulled the trigger. The cannon thundered, the recoil slamming through the cabin. The shot struck the Sherman square in the turret, tearing through it like paper. The American tank burst in flame. Cheers erupted inside the Panther. But then, before the echoes even faded, a new sound rolled in. Dozens of engines. Karl's blood turned cold. One Sherman was dead. 20 more were coming. The field lit up with muzzle flashes. Explosions ripped the ground around them. Each blast shook the Panther like a hammer against an anvil. The tank groaned, its suspension screaming as the mud beneath it shifted. A shell struck the rear armour. The engine compartment burst into flames. Franz screamed as fire rolled up the wall behind him. Smoke filled the turret, thick and choking. "Out!" Karl shouted. "Everyone out!" The crew scrambled through the hatch, tumbling into the mud. Franz rolled, clutching his arm, his sleeve on fire. Otto dragged him to a ditch as another explosion tore through their tank. The Panther's ammunition cooked off, sending shards of steel whistling through the air. Karl threw himself flat. The blast hit like thunder. When he looked up, their once mighty machine was gone, just a burning hulk, its barrel bent downward like a dying animal's neck. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The fog glowed orange from the flames. The Shermans rolled past in the distance, engines steady, silhouettes moving like ghosts through the storm. Franz turned to Karl, eyes wide with disbelief. "All that armour, all that power, and it dies in the mud." Karl didn't look away from the fire. "Power's useless when it can't move," he said, "and pride doesn't float." As the flames consumed what remained of their Panther, Karl realized something every German soldier was beginning to learn the hard way. The war had shifted. It was no longer about who had the strongest machine. It was about who could keep theirs moving, and the Americans never stopped. June 29th, 1944, south of St. Lo, Normandy. The rain had finally stopped, but the ground hadn't forgiven them. What used to be fields and country roads were now oceans of mud and wreckage, tank husks, burned trucks, helmets half buried like bones. The air reeked of rot and diesel. Karl Richter led what was left of his crew down a narrow farm lane bordered by shattered apple trees. Franz limped beside him, his arm bandaged with a torn shirt. Otto carried his MP40 close to his chest, every nerve stretched thin. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. The panther that had once felt like an indestructible fortress now existed only as smoke curling from the distance behind them. "Command said to regroup in Coutances," Otto muttered. "If anyone's still there." Karl didn't reply. Every hour they passed more wrecks. Tigers, panthers, half-tracks, all abandoned for lack of fuel. Some crews had set charges before leaving, blowing open their own machines to keep them from Allied hands. Others hadn't even had the time. They found one panther still intact, tilted in a ditch, its crew slumped against the hull, dead from shrapnel. Franz stopped to look at them. "They could have been us," he whispered. Karl adjusted his cap, eyes fixed forward. "They still are." The sky rumbled again, not thunder this time, but aircraft. The men dove under a hedgerow as P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, their engines howling like demons. Seconds later, rockets slammed into the fields ahead, throwing dirt and metal skyward. The blast wave rolled through their hiding spot. Franz covered his ears. "They don't even fight us. They just erase the map." Karl glanced upward through the leaves, watching the planes circle back toward the front. "That's what air superiority means." His voice was flat. "We used to have it." When the air quieted again, the 3 men pressed on. They crossed a burned farmhouse, the roof collapsed inward. On the wall, someone had scrawled in charcoal, "Keine Hilfe kommt," no help is coming. By evening, they reached what remained of a supply column. Carts overturned, fuel barrels split open, a handful of dazed soldiers trying to patch a truck. An officer waved them over. "Where's your vehicle?" he demanded. "Gone," Karl said. "Destroyed near Le Désert." The officer looked him up and down. "You're not the only ones." Half the armor's gone. Panthers, tigers, all of them stuck or burned. He pointed down the road, where a column of Shermans was visible in the far distance, their silhouettes crawling along the ridge. They don't stop. Not at night, not in rain. Every hour they move, we sink deeper. Karl stared at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the clouds blood red. "Then we don't fight them in the fields," he said quietly. "We fight them in the towns, where mud and sky don't matter." Franz gave a dry laugh. "And when the towns are rubble?" Karl didn't answer. He started walking again, boots sinking into the mud with every step. That night they slept in a barn with 20 other soldiers, tankers, infantry, radio men, all mixed together now. No one talked about victory anymore. They talked about fuel, bread, and the next village still in German hands. Before sleeping, Otto asked softly, "Do you think Berlin knows what's happening here?" Karl stared at the cracked wooden beams above him. Outside, rain began again, tapping gently against the roof. "They'll know soon," he said, "when the Shermans roll through Paris." In the darkness, he could still hear engines, steady, distant, relentless. The sound of a war that refused to stop. July 1st, 1944. Coutances Road, Normandy. The dawn was colourless. A pale mist clung to the earth, and the world smelled of damp soil, gasoline and smoke. What remained of the German armour was crawling south toward Coutances, a slow, desperate retreat that stretched for miles. Karl walked alongside a half-track loaded with wounded soldiers. The once disciplined convoy was now chaos, tanks without fuel being towed by trucks, trucks without tyres dragging bare rims through the mud. Horses stumbled beside machines worth more than entire villages. Every kilometre, the sound of Allied artillery followed. The Americans were closing in. Franz limped ahead, scanning the tree line with his rifle ready. "You think they'll let us reach Coutances?" Karl adjusted the strap on his helmet. "They'll let us reach it," he said, "but we won't hold it." A panther passed by, its hull scarred, turret dented from near misses. On the side, someone had painted a crude message in white. Bis zum Ende. Until the end. The driver looked down at Karl and shouted through the roar of the engine, "How's your crew?" Karl gave a half smile. "Still walking?" The man nodded grimly. "Better than most." The Panther's engine roared as it pushed forward, treads flinging mud like rain. Watching it, Karl felt the same sting of pride he'd felt weeks ago, and the same ache of betrayal. The machine was beautiful, magnificent even. But he knew what would happen when the next storm came. The road narrowed through a small village, or what was left of one. Houses shattered, carts overturned, walls blackened from explosions. A church steeple leaned precariously against the sky. They stopped for fuel, or what little remained of it. Otto siphoned from a drum while Franz handed out water to wounded infantrymen sitting in the gutter. One young soldier, barely old enough to shave, looked up at Karl. "Is it true, Herr Feldwebel? They say the Americans have a tank that never breaks." Karl's jaw tightened. "No tank never breaks," he said, "but theirs break less than ours." The boy frowned. "How?" Karl glanced toward the distant horizon, where faint engine noise carried on the wind. "Because they built thousands," he said, "and we built perfection." At that moment, an air raid siren screamed, short, panicked, and close. The convoy erupted into motion. "Aircraft! Take cover!" someone yelled. Karl dove into a ditch with Franz and Otto. A second later, the sky filled with the roar of P-47s. Rockets streaked down, exploding along the road. Fireballs tore through the trucks and fuel drums. The air turned to heat and noise. A Panther ahead took a direct hit, its turret blasted clean off. Bodies flew through the air like rag dolls. Horses screamed. The ground shook so hard Karl's teeth clacked together. He pressed his face into the mud, heart hammering. "They're killing everything," shouted Franz. The attack lasted less than a minute, and when it ended, silence fell heavier than the smoke. The entire convoy was in ruins. Flames licked at the edges of the road. Men stumbled through the wreckage, coughing, calling for help. Otto crawled from the ditch, his uniform covered in ash. "No more trucks," he said flatly. "No more fuel." Karl stood, staring down the road. The black smoke stretched for miles. It looked like the end of the world. Somewhere beyond that curtain of fire, he could still hear the sound of engines, the same low, steady hum that had haunted them for days. Shermans, always moving, always closing. He turned to his crew. "We're on foot now." Franz gave a weary smile. "You think we'll make it?" Karl slung his rifle over his shoulder. "We've made it this far," he said, "but the war's already past us." They began walking south, boots sinking into the mud that had become their enemy and their grave. The rain started again, soft at first, then harder. The sound of distant artillery faded into the steady rhythm of drops hitting the earth, a requiem for the armour of a dying army. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the Shermans rolled on. July 5th, 1944, the northern edge of Coutances, Normandy. The Germans were running out of everything: food, ammunition, men, and most of all, time. Coutances was supposed to be the last defensive line before retreating toward Brittany, but when Karl and his surviving crew reached it, the line was a rumour. The town was a graveyard of twisted steel and broken faith. They had marched for 4 days through shell-pocked roads and burning fields. Every night, the thunder of artillery followed them like an echo of inevitability. The sky itself seemed American now, filled with the constant growl of engines, the drone of reconnaissance planes, the flash of bombers on the horizon. Coutances lay ahead, grey and ghostly beneath drifting smoke. As they entered the outskirts, Karl noticed civilians wandering the streets, hollow-eyed, carrying what little they could. French villagers stared at the retreating Germans with a strange mixture of hatred and pity. "They don't even look afraid anymore," Franz said quietly. "They know who's coming." Otto spat into the dust. "Maybe they should be afraid of us again." But even as he said it, they all knew it wasn't true. At the town square, the remnants of an armoured battalion had formed a makeshift command post. 2 Panthers, 3 Panzer IVs, and a handful of anti-tank guns. The officers argued over maps spread across a broken café table. Karl approached one of them, Hauptmann Weiss, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a bandaged hand. "Reporting from Le Désert sector," Karl said, saluting. "Panther destroyed. Crew intact." Weiss nodded curtly. "You're lucky." "Most aren't. The Americans have broken through Avranches. They'll be here within days. We're ordered to delay them as long as possible." "Delay with what?" Karl asked. Weiss smiled bitterly. "With whatever still moves." He pointed toward a nearby field where a single Panther was being repaired by a group of mechanics. Its side armour was riddled with holes, its tracks bent, but the crew worked feverishly, sweating and shouting. Karl's gaze lingered on it. "You're sending that thing back into battle?" Weiss's eyes hardened. "We don't have battles anymore, Feldwebel. We have sacrifices." By afternoon the order came down: hold Coutances at all costs. The Panthers were positioned along the main road, their turrets aimed north. Infantry spread through the ruins. The smell of diesel filled the air again, familiar yet hollow, like the ghost of a lost age. As night fell, the horizon began to flicker. The Americans were coming. The glow of their artillery illuminated the clouds, flashes of fire moving closer with every passing minute. Franz sat in a doorway, cradling his rifle, staring at the ground. "You think they'll hit us with tanks again?" Karl checked the clip on his pistol. "They'll hit us with everything." The first shells struck before midnight. The town shook, roofs collapsing in showers of sparks. The earth itself seemed to breathe fire. Karl's ears rang as he sprinted toward the nearest Panther, the one Weiss had pointed out earlier. Its engine was running, trembling like a dying animal. He climbed aboard, shouting over the noise. "Where's Weiss?" "Dead," the gunner yelled. "We're all that's left." "Then we fight." The Panther fired into the night, its muzzle flash illuminating rubble and smoke. The recoil nearly threw Karl off the turret. The shell slammed into a Sherman rounding the corner, blowing it apart in a fireball. But for every tank they stopped, 2 more appeared, rolling through the smoke like steel ghosts. American infantry poured in behind them, rifles flashing in the dark. The Germans fell back street by street. Each block was a furnace of screams and shattered glass. The Panther's gun jammed after the 3rd shot. Karl pounded the side of the turret, shouting for the loader to fix it, but the man was already dead, a piece of shrapnel buried in his throat. "Abandon it!" Otto yelled. "It's done!" Karl hesitated, then dropped from the hull just as another shell hit the Panther square in the engine deck. The explosion hurled him into the street. He landed hard, gasping, ears ringing. Through the haze, he saw his last tank, his final machine, burning against the backdrop of a collapsing town. The Panther's turret slowly turned one last time, hydraulics whining before catching fire completely. It was as if the machine itself was trying to fight, even as its death consumed it. Franz dragged Karl into an alley, coughing, his uniform soaked in soot. "It's over," he said hoarsely. "They're everywhere." Karl looked up through the swirling ash. The Shermans were rolling into the square now, their silhouettes cutting through the smoke. Civilians emerged from hiding, watching in stunned silence. The German flag atop the town hall burned to ash. Karl felt a strange calm settle over him. "Not everywhere," he said softly. "Just moving forward." He knew then that nothing could stop them. Not armour, not weather, not pride. The war machine Germany had built had crushed itself under its own perfection, while the clumsy, stubborn Shermans just kept moving. And as Coutances fell, Karl understood the real weapon the Americans had never lost. Momentum. July 7th, 1944. South of Coutances, Normandy. The night after Coutances fell was eerily quiet. No artillery, no aircraft. Just the soft patter of rain on broken roofs and the occasional distant hum of engines, not German ones, but the same low, reliable growl that had haunted Karl for weeks. He and his two remaining men, Franz and Otto, had escaped through the orchards under cover of darkness. They carried what little they had left, a single rifle, half a canteen of water, and uniforms stained black from soot. They were soldiers with no army now, wandering through a land that had stopped belonging to them. The countryside was alive with sound, not the chaos of battle, but the slow, methodical movement of an occupying force. Allied convoys were already rolling through the valleys, headlights cutting beams through the mist. The war wasn't creeping forward anymore. It was marching. Karl led his men into a thicket by a stream where they collapsed under a fallen oak. For a long time, none of them spoke. The only light came from the glow of a burning town in the distance, Coutances still smouldering. Franz broke the silence. "I saw something today," he said quietly. "A line of American tanks. Must have been 50, all Shermans. None of them stopped. Not one. Even the ones hit just kept going." Karl didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. Otto rubbed his hands together, trying to stay warm. "They don't fight like we do," he muttered. "We build one perfect tank. They build 10 good ones. We fight for honour. They fight for movement." "Movement wins wars," Karl said finally. A long silence followed. Rain dripped from the trees. Somewhere beyond the hills, an American column was setting up camp. They could hear distant voices, laughing, shouting, the clatter of tin cups. Franz's voice was barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Karl's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his pistol. The metal felt heavier than ever. He stared at it for a long time before holstering it again. "We surrender." Otto's head snapped up. "You can't be serious." Karl met his gaze. "Look around you, Otto. There's nothing left to fight with, nothing left to fight for." Franz nodded weakly. "Better prisoners than ghosts." They waited until dawn, then stepped out of the trees with their hands raised. The American patrol that found them was young, barely more than boys, but their weapons were steady. "Hands up! Drop the rifle!" one shouted in accented German. Karl complied, letting his rifle fall into the mud. The sergeant approached cautiously, eyes scanning their uniforms. "Panzer crew?" Karl nodded. The American smirked. "Figured. We saw what's left of your cats back there." He motioned toward the road where burnt panthers lay scattered. "Hell of a machine. Too bad it hates mud." Karl almost smiled. "Yes," he said quietly. "Too bad." The sergeant gestured toward a convoy of trucks behind him. "You boys are lucky. Prisoner camp outside Rennes. Food, cigarettes, coffee if you behave." Franz blinked. "Coffee?" The sergeant laughed. "Yeah, real coffee. Not that black tar you drink." The 3 Germans exchanged glances. For a moment, Franz actually smiled. Otto shook his head in disbelief. As they were led toward the trucks, Karl looked back once more at the road behind them. Smoke still drifted where Coutances had burned. Beyond that, the endless fields of Normandy and the wrecks of machines that had once defined power. The Shermans rolled past them in the opposite direction, fresh, refueled, engines humming. One of the tanks bore a name painted on its hull. "Easy does it." Karl watched it pass, the irony cutting deep. There was nothing easy about war, but somehow these men made it look effortless. As the convoy carried them away, he thought of something he had once told Franz back before St. Lo, when they still laughed at the Shermans. "Power without movement is just a monument," he had said. Now he knew what came next in that sentence. Movement without arrogance conquers everything. July 14th, 1944. Rennes, France. The POW camp sat on the edge of a field once lined with wheat, now flattened by truck tires and canvas tents. Rows of barbed wire glistened under the afternoon sun. Guard towers overlooked 1,000 men, dirty, hungry, and silent. Karl, Franz, and Otto were among them now, no longer tankers, just prisoners in grey uniforms with red armbands marked PW. They had traded the roar of the Panther for the quiet hum of an American generator. Every morning began the same way, the clang of metal pots, the whistle of guards, the smell of something resembling coffee. But this was not the punishment Karl expected. He sat at a wooden table one morning, staring into a tin cup filled with dark liquid. Real coffee. Hot. Steam rising into the cool air. Franz sat beside him, chewing bread like he hadn't eaten in years. Otto leaned back, arms crossed, watching a group of Americans repairing a jeep nearby. "They're laughing," Otto said, his voice almost confused. "They laugh during war." Karl looked up. "Because they know they'll go home." On the other side of the wire, an American sergeant passed out cigarettes to his men. He caught Karl's gaze and gave a small nod before tossing him a pack across the fence. The German stared at it for a moment, uncertain. Franz picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. "They're giving them away?" Karl opened the pack, drew one cigarette, and struck a match. He inhaled deeply, the smoke burning in his lungs. "They can afford to," he said. "They have more of everything." In the distance, a convoy of trucks rumbled past, each loaded with supplies, crates stacked to the sky. Shermans were being towed on trailers, cleaned, refitted, ready for the next advance. The war machine that had crushed their world kept moving, smooth and efficient. A young American guard approached the fence, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He looked no older than 19. "You guys from the tank division?" he asked in halting German. Karl nodded. "Panther Battalion. Near St. Lo." The guard whistled. "Panthers, huh? We saw what you did out there. You boys hit hard. But when those cats get stuck..." He chuckled. "Well, they're not so scary then." Karl smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Not scary. Just heavy." The guard leaned closer. "You know, our tanks, they ain't perfect either. We just fix 'em faster, got spare parts for everything." "Everything?" Franz asked skeptically. "Everything," the guard replied proudly. "Treads, guns, even coffee pots. If it breaks, we got 5 more waiting." He walked off, humming a tune, something bright and easy, like a song from a world that had never seen mud or fire. That night, as the camp lights flickered on, Karl couldn't sleep. The air was filled with the distant rumble of trains carrying tanks eastward. The Americans were already preparing for the next push. Franz stirred beside him. "Do you think they'll win soon?" Karl didn't answer immediately. He watched the glow of the floodlights through the barbed wire, tracing each wire's curve like the outline of a map. "They already have," he said finally. "We just haven't been told yet." He thought back to the first day of the invasion, the laughter, the arrogance, the certainty that German steel was invincible. He could still see the mud swallowing the Panthers, still smell the rain and smoke, still hear the endless growl of the Shermans that refused to die. For the first time in years, Karl felt something that wasn't anger or fear. It was clarity. War wasn't won by the strongest. It was won by those who never stopped moving forward. August 1st, 1944. POW Camp, Rennes, France. Morning mist drifted over the camp like smoke that refused to die. Beyond the barbed wire, the war continued to rumble. Faint explosions somewhere far east, the distant growl of engines, the occasional passing convoy headed toward Paris. The Americans moved like clockwork. Their trucks never stopped. Their supply lines never broke. Karl sat at a wooden table near the fence, whittling a piece of wood with a pocket knife an American guard had given him. Each curl of wood fell like a fragment of memory, thin, fragile, disappearing into the dirt. Franz sat beside him, staring into the distance. "They say Paris is next," he murmured. "Then Germany." Otto was lying on his back in the grass, eyes half closed. "They'll never make it that far." But Karl didn't answer. He'd learned that hope and denial were just different uniforms for the same illusion. He could hear the Shermans again that morning, their tracks grinding, their engines humming, moving east. The sound was steady, almost soothing now. It had become the rhythm of inevitability. One of the guards, the same young sergeant who'd given him the cigarettes, walked by with a mug of coffee. He nodded. "Morning, fellas." Karl nodded back. "Morning." The guard stopped. "You know, they're saying the Panther was the best damn tank of the war. Engineers back home can't stop talking about it." Karl smiled faintly. "The best tank," he said softly. "And still buried in mud." The guard laughed. "Guess even the best gets stuck sometimes." He sipped his coffee and kept walking. Karl watched him go, then looked down at his hands, scarred, cracked, blackened by years of oil and fire. "We built a weapon," he said quietly. "They built an army." Franz looked up. "What's the difference?" Karl gazed at the horizon, where a line of trucks shimmered through the heat. "A weapon ends when it fires. An army never stops moving." That afternoon, the prisoners were lined up as new arrivals entered the camp. Dozens of captured Germans from the Falaise pocket, mud-covered, eyes hollow. They looked broken, not just in body but in spirit. Some of them still wore tank badges. Karl recognized the insignia of his old division. One man, barely 20, stumbled as he walked. Karl reached out to steady him. The young soldier's face was grey with exhaustion. "Panther crew?" Karl asked. The boy nodded. "Yes, we tried to fight near Argentan. The Shermans, there were hundreds. They came from every side. We couldn't move. The mud, it was everywhere again." His voice cracked. "We burned them. All of them. And then we ran." Karl's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder. "You did what you could." The boy shook his head. "No, we did what they told us. They said the Panther would save us." Karl didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. That night, long after lights out, Karl lay awake listening to the rain tapping softly against the tent. The rhythm reminded him of tracks turning through mud, slow, steady, unstoppable. He closed his eyes and saw it all again, the hedgerows, the smoke, the burning sky over Saint-Lô, the laughter of his men when the first Shermans appeared, the screams when the engines failed, the silence after. War had been a teacher, brutal, unforgiving, patient. And its final lesson was simple. No machine, no weapon, no empire could outlast movement. The Americans had understood that. They didn't fight for perfection, they fought for progress. They didn't build legends, they built replacements. Karl turned on his side, pulling the thin blanket over his shoulders. The sound of the Shermans faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle hum of the camp generator. He whispered, half to himself, half to the ghosts of his crew. "Let them move. Let them keep moving." Because once we stopped, the war was already lost. Outside, dawn began to rise, pale gold over the wire, spilling across the camp like a quiet surrender. And somewhere east of Rennes, the engines of the Shermans roared again. not as enemies, but as the echo of a new world that refused to stand still.